QSO Today, episode 375, Nelson Farrier NF7Z. My thanks to Icoms America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign for Zulu 1 Uniform Golf, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I want to thank Mark Seidel, KR3AM, for funding the transcription of episode 373 with Paul Mower, VA6MPM. To get to this transcription, go to the episode and click on the center button under the opening picture on the show notes page. Thanks, Mark. Nelson Farrier NF7Z came to my attention when he made a presentation on the life and times of Hiram Percy Maxim, founder of the ARRL and the amateur radio hobby, at last August's QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. While Nelson is a relatively recent ham, as a teacher of STEM learning to children, he has some refreshing insight into what we as amateur radio community can do better to relate to children and strengthen our numbers with younger hams. NF7Z is my QSO Today. NF7Z, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Nelson?
I am.
Nelson, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I know that you're a relatively recent new member of the amateur radio community. However, there is a backstory that goes to the beginning of who you are. Can we start at the beginning of your story?
Sure. I actually had experience with amateur radio as a young boy. I had a neighbor, Norman Villasana, silent key now, WB7FIB, who was quite the ham. He had a whole room devoted to amateur radio and they had a tower in the backyard. And I remember one time he invited me over to see it. The problem was that I was, I think, probably in 4th or 5th grade, and I really was kind of frustrated because his signals often messed up with my Saturday morning cartoon shows. And while I was impressed with his knowledge of geography, I couldn't understand why anybody would want to spend that much time doing Morse code to people he hadn't met. But later, well, as time progressed, I was always interested in electronics and experiments. My dad strongly encouraged me to do that, and I was fortunate to live during the days of Radio Shack electronic kits. And I remember for 2 Halloweens, I made a Lost in Space robot costume that was complete with blinking lights on the belly and a little throat light that I activated with a hand switch.
Can you talk a little bit about what led you to the choices that you made for your education and career and what those choices were? You started to allude to it, but maybe some more detail.
When I was getting ready to go to college, I had experience with computers and computer programming back in the semi-mainframe era. The MS-DOS wasn't quite out yet. But I had experience with using stereos and getting those to work correctly and wiring them. And anyway, I was always fascinated by electronics. And with the majors as they were, there wasn't that I ever saw a computer science thing where you could learn about that. And I thought I'd like to go into business administration with an emphasis on technology. And then when I went to my first year of college at Miami, Ohio, in Oxford, Ohio. Kind of weird that I went to Oxford in Ohio. But anyway, while I was there, it was a small little college town, and I missed seeing children. I had participated in scouting for much of my youth and was very involved in working at summer camps and Cub Day camps and going on my own troops outings. But while I was at college, I realized how much I missed being with the youth. And I made a decision there that I would kind of follow my heart rather than a paycheck, and went into teaching. And I was really glad I did, because while it was quite a challenge, I was involved with people. And so I kind of did the technology on the side. I dabbled in being a computer consultant, and I did off freelance programming and consulting and helping businesses get starting to use technology, and had the dubious honor of working with Windows 1.0 and Windows 2.0 before it became popular. And anyway, so throughout my teaching career, I always kind of had an emphasis in doing stuff with technology.
How it is that you found yourself teaching kids and how you ended up, I understand that you went to middle school and you were the math and science teacher. How did that happen?
Well, while I was in Ohio, I changed my major, and I also realized I went to Ohio originally because it was an excellent business administration school. But when I realized that I wanted to teach, and I also realized that you get out of college what you put into it, not necessarily. I know there's a stigma or a benefit to going to certain schools, but I realized if I wanted to teach in Oregon, that I probably should go to an Oregon school to get an Oregon teaching license. I also was in college very interested in religion, and I ended up serving a church mission for a year and a half after my first year of college. And so when I came back to Oregon.
And where did you go?
I ended up going to Seoul, South Korea.
And you were there 2 years?
At that particular time, it was only a year and a half.
And what did you think of being the kid from the Midwest in Seoul, South Korea?
Well, I'm actually from Oregon, but I left to kind of leave town to go to Ohio. But it was quite unique. It was the first time in my life that I'd ever really been a minority, and trying to converse with people in Korean was very humbling. It is probably, I've been told by people who are in language centers that it's that and Finnish and Navajo are probably among the three most difficult non-English-like languages. And so, but it was really quite eye-opening. It really gave me a great appreciation for living in a very prosperous, democratic country. That was my first experience with, I saw riots at one point that I was surprised at and had tear gas shot, not over my head, but over the heads of some students while I was there. It was before Korea was really as well established as it is now. It was back in the early 80s. And anyway, it was just a remarkable experience, very growth promoting. And so that gave me an interest in what was going on in the world. I had really a lot of interest in world geography and history because I wanted to know why things were the way they were. So when I went to college, I kept track of what was going on in the world. I participated in a Model United Nations events that were there that high schools were holding on our campus, and so I was assisting with that. So anyway, while I was going to college at the University of Oregon, that was when I decided to focus on elementary education specifically, and then eventually when I graduated, at the time there was it was really difficult to get into the teaching profession, and so I was given an opportunity to teach in a middle school in a low-income part of town in Springfield, Oregon, and I said yes, because if you didn't say yes, you didn't have a job. So that started my career, and I eventually realized that middle school was kind of the right fit, because while the children are younger, they're still kind of in that cute stage. Whereas, later in middle school, it's the who are you today kind of stage. And do you have children?
Yes, I do. But I remember middle school as being terrifying.
Yes. Yeah.
Those transitional years, right, between being a baby and maybe a bigger baby.
Right. Hormones with feet.
That's it.
So somebody once described middle school students more like 2-year-olds, not because of the maturity level, but because they don't belong. 2-year-olds aren't infants, and they're not little children. They're just kind of in between. They don't have a place. And middle school students are a lot like that. They're not high school kids, but we won't let them get away with some of the things they could do in elementary school, like throw fits. But anyway, I really came to enjoy, for the most part, teaching mostly sixth graders, and I taught them science, and I taught physical science. So I got to shoot things across the room, and we blew things up, and we launched things, and did things with electronics, which was really quite fun. And so when the Teacher Institute came around, I thought, well, this might be a neat opportunity.
So you're referring to the ARRL Teacher Institute that they run every summer.
So would you like me to go into some background about that?
Before we get there, how many years were you teaching in middle school before this opportunity came up?
let's see, if that was 2012, I had been teaching since 87.
From 1987, you were teaching almost the same subjects. Were you in the same school or were you moving around?
I wasn't teaching the same subject. As a generalist at the time, they really liked generalists in middle school because they could assign you if they needed more math teachers, they could make you teach more math. If they needed more social studies teachers, they could play around with staffing a whole lot easier if you could teach a variety of subjects. And so I started out in teaching for the first 5 years, teaching language arts, reading, and social studies. And then I had a 3-year stint as a curriculum specialist. So I was out of the classroom for a little while, and I was doing support for math and science teachers, helping with textbook adoptions and with bringing in hired help to do teacher development in math and science. And then eventually they added social studies to that mix. So I was very involved with what was going on in the math and science areas, K-12 at the time. And then eventually that was only a temporary or short-term thing. And so after 3 years of that, I went and taught at a place called Hamlin Middle School. And I was in a self-contained class for about 5 years there. And then things changed.
What does that mean? I'm sorry, Nelson. What is self-contained?
So I had the students all day like an elementary teacher would. That yes, they're in middle school. Yeah, it was a nice model. Yes, they were in middle school and they had lockers and they had dress down PE and they had opportunity for electives, but they had one teacher for most of the day. So if they were struggling, there would be one point of contact. And I was it for about 30 students. And then they would have specialty classes, electives, where they could go do music or shop or home ec or something like that.
A lot of these elective courses in middle schools and high schools are no longer available. Are there still shop classes? Are there still these elective courses these days in schools?
In Eugene proper, there have not been or as many. In Springfield, which is a smaller town next to us, about a 12-minute drive, they are more traditional about their curriculum, and so they tend not to move as quickly with the rest of the teaching profession is very susceptible to jumping on the bandwagon with whatever new and great idea comes down the pike. So Springfield doesn't do that as much, and so we still had shop and home ec classes. And as far as I know, they still have a shop class. Home ec is more difficult, but at the time they did.
In retrospect, how important are those classes to developing young people into adults?
Oh, I think they're extremely important, far more important than people would often admit who are in charge of education. But the bulk of the population are really interested in making sure it happens. In fact, my own state of Oregon has recently, there was a groundswell of initiative petitions to put forth a law that required schools to be funded so that they could have those kinds of programs. And so most parents want them.
It seems to me that maybe there's an assumption that every kid is on an academic track, and by losing all of those other classes, it may deny some kids opportunities just to find work out of high school because they may not be going on to higher education. Is that what you saw?
It is. In fact, the longer I taught, the more I came to realize that teachers by and large were decent students, and because they were successful in academics, they kind of saw the world through those eyes. And in order to get ahead, you had to be going to college. And then as I continued to teach, there were periods of time where I kind of didn't like my job because I was working in a low-income school and things were really tough. And so I dabbled in, as I mentioned, doing computer consulting. And then I tried to do part-time financial, helping people with their finances with a financial services company. And the more I did those things, the more I realized that those things didn't require a college degree. And then I started meeting people who were laborers, who did welding and who did construction, and realized that a lot of this college prep track that we were pushing kids to had some systemic problems to them. One was that a lot of times it wasn't age appropriate. It is not really age appropriate to try to teach really young children like 6th or 7th grade algebra, because they just don't have their brains aren't developed the way they need to be able to do abstracting like that. To teach, we used to teach geography, which was much more relevant to students. And then we started teaching more ancient history. And I don't know of very many things that are less developmentally appropriate than teaching ancient Egyptian culture to a 6th grader. And instead of geography, like where Canada is and where Mexico is, and a little bit about the United States and how it fits and the differences in cultures. So I have watched this trend, and then as I got involved in amateur radio, realized how many people, I mean, obviously for engineering, you need a great deal of math and science, but for the bulk of the population, lots of times the education system wasn't serving them very well. In fact, it put them in worse condition. A perfect example would be, we have a neighbor who used to help do placement with high school graduates to get them to be apprentices to be an apprentice electrician or plumber. And so for 4 years, they would be paid half a wage. So they'd get about $20,000 every year to be apprenticed to an electrician, a journeyman electrician, or plumber. And after 4 years, they would have their, I guess it's a license to be able to put up their own sign on their own shop or go work for somebody else. And so after 4 years, they'd made $80,000 and had a skill that was marketable and had 4 years of experience, and they knew they liked it. Whereas a competing college student had spent 4 years in a subject where they'd never been out in the field doing it, may or may not like their job, and were now $80,000 in debt. So, I started to realize, not that I'm not a fan of some of the things that you can learn in college, but it wasn't for everybody. And sometimes it would put people behind if what they wanted to do didn't require a college degree.
And now this message from ICOM America. Spice up your ham shack with Icoms IC705. This portable radio is perfect for staying in and venturing out and working your favorite bands this winter season. Happy holidays from ICOM. The Icom IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion. Base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingertips in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. It has a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display, 5 watts with the BP272, 10 watts with the 13.8 volts DC power supply, single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functionality, a touchscreen display, micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, speaker microphone using the HM243, and it comes standard. It supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for your IC705 and room for accessories for SOTA activations or a day out in the wild. Our family of favorite ICOM amateur radios are also available this holiday season. The IC9700, the IC9300, the IC7610 base stations, the ID52A handheld coming soon, and the ID5100A mobile are the perfect gifts, and it's the most wonderful time of the year to give a gift of ICOM. For more information, click on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page, and when you purchase your new ICOM rig, please tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. You mentioned that you did electronics, or you did some electronic projects. Did you have an interest in electronics at home, and were you doing small computers and things like this so that you could make these demonstrations?
I would often do some electronic things at home, but not very many. Most of it were because mostly what I was teaching was simple circuits and parallel circuits and a little bit of using proper symbols for electronics. So I didn't do a whole lot at home, mostly because the Radio Shack, the kits had all dried up, and the ones that I wanted to do were either beastly expensive or too simple. So I wasn't doing a whole lot. I was doing a lot of, to back up, I told you I spent a lot of years in scouting. And one of the things that scouting often taught was scouting was about doing and not listening. And so I tried to teach my classes that way rather than teach them about, for example, pH in chemistry and tell them about it. We had a pH indicator. Turns out that you can get red cabbage and you can blanch it, and it turns the water a bluish purple color, and it makes a great pH indicator. It turns about 6 or 7 different colors depending on what you put into it. And so we would spend 2 days just finding things to put into this cabbage water pH solution, and the kids loved it. And I would try to do my physics that way as well. I'd have the kids do things rather than just listen to things, which is actually one of the reasons why when I started meeting people in amateur radio that it really appealed to me, because it was all about doing and not just being taught in a classroom like at college.
Let's talk a little bit about now the ARRL Teacher Institute. How did you discover it, or how did they discover you, and what was involved in enrolling and being part of that project?
Well, as I mentioned, this mentor of mine, Dave Freeman, N7WPB, told me about it and encouraged me to apply. And so the application was rather rigorous for somebody who didn't have an amateur radio background, but we were allowed to research some of the questions. And I think it really was to see who was committed enough to really fill out the paperwork and answer some of the questions to make sure that they were getting people who were committed, not just taking advantage of the opportunity. But for those who aren't aware, the ARRL Teacher Institute started back in about 2002, and it's a 4-day expenses-paid professional development seminar for teachers to help them teach their own students about radio and motivate them and other staff to learn more about wireless technology. There are several sessions held throughout the year at a variety of locations and states, and at the time, I had the first. There are 2 levels of institute. There's the first one, and then eventually they developed a second one. But the one that I was attending was held in Rockland, California, which is right outside of Sacramento. And it was taught by Tony Gober, N5DUX, Mark Spencer, WA8SME, and Miguel Enriquez, KD7RPP. And they were great. And I cannot tell you how exciting this was for me as somebody with my background to be at one of these teacher institutes. It was, I don't want to overstate it, but for me, it changed the direction of my career, and it changed me personally because it was very affirming. I had, as an elementary teacher, most of the colleagues that I worked with were not that interested in math and science. And I was sort of the anomaly. I was the only one in my teacher cadre when I was in my student teacher cadre who was an elementary ed major who was also taking calculus and physics with calculus. So I was always really interested in why things worked. And when I would share things at the lunch table, a lot of them would just smile and nod and say, "That's nice, Nelson." And that would go on and we'd change the subject. But when I attended the Teacher Institute, not only were the teachers interesting, but the other people who were attending had the same kinds of interests I did. They wanted to know why things worked. They looked at the same websites that I did when the astronomy of the day, astronomy picture of the day thing, or some other science-related activities that we all had in common. And I realized that I wasn't alone. Instead of being this science nerd that I'd kind of felt like I was, I realized that among people with an engineering background, I was kind of normal. And that made me much more comfortable to take steps toward doing some more science things with my students that involved amateur radio and involved doing more things with electronics. One of the things that the Teacher Institute provided us was a lot of books, including Teacher's Guide to Teaching the Tech class. It had a basic electronics book. One of the reasons they provided those books was to help you, perhaps, if you were teaching a high school class, for example, you could have the kids at the end of the class be able to have enough background knowledge to take the technician's test and pass it. Working with middle school students, that wasn't my goal, but They gave us boards that would show how modulation and demodulation worked. So and it had little taps, you could hook it up to an oscilloscope, and you could actually see the waveforms as they were modulated and demodulated. And you could see the whole process of how radio worked with it. And we had a project to learn how to solder. We had little microprocessors that we could program. Rockland, California is the headquarters of Parallax, which is a company that produces a basic stamp. It was an early microprocessor company. If anybody's familiar with Arduinos, this was the precursor to that. And it's a very popular, it was at the time in particular, a very popular microprocessor, but it wasn't open source. And in the Teacher Institute, we also learned about satellite communication, and that was really exciting. I thought initially that had great potential to be something I could bring back to the classroom. Remember, we were out once with a 2-meter handheld and an ARRL handheld Yagi antenna, and in a short, I think it was like a 7.5-minute flyover, we heard a station from California, Texas, Mexico, Alaska, and Massachusetts, all in one satellite pass over, and that was amazing.
How big was your class, Nelson?
I think there were probably about 14 to 15 people, is my recollection.
And were there hands-on workshops? I mean, you were taken out in the yard with a guy that knows how to point an antenna at a satellite and make a contact, but did they actually have something that you could build over that 3-day period and feel like you accomplished something?
They gave us a link to a 2-meter tape measure antenna building project that later I came and did myself, and then eventually our local amateur radio club. We've done 2 workshops where I brought people over to my garage, and we built scores of these tape measure antennas, and then right afterwards had bunny hunts, or the fox hunts. Locally, they've been calling them bunny hunts here. But anyway, and turns out with students, the satellite work didn't work so well because the flyovers were only at certain times, and you weren't guaranteed to have success. But at least at the workshop, it wasn't one guy showing us how to do it. It was, here's the radio, this is what you say. He demonstrated for one contact and then handed the radio to somebody else. And a third person was holding the Yagi and using some software on the phone to figure out where the flyover was, so he was pointing it in the right direction. So it wasn't, they did it right. They didn't just tell us about it. They had us do it rather than demonstrate it.
Now, is the goal of the Teachers Institute to create amateur radio operators out of you and the kids, or is it a way to maybe embed STEM more into the teacher's curriculum?
More of the latter, but actually both. You do not have to have a license to be part of the Teacher Institute, although most of them did, and those who didn't were strongly encouraged to. But the real goal was to expose teachers to the host of different facets of amateur radio. I was doing something for our local club's website. We had some special interest groups, and just on a lark, I decided to start writing all of the different permutations of amateur radio, everywhere from QRP to DXing to software-defined radio, and all the stuff you can do with emergency communications and putting radios in RVs and mobiles, and then all the electronics. There are at least 52 different facets of amateur radio that are easily available to anybody who's interested. And what they wanted to do was show people that radio was not just about necessarily sitting in a small room doing Morse code. It was far, far more than that. And then it is also accessible to students. There is a second Teacher Institute. In fact, I was able to go to that one 3 or 4 years later. And their focus was balloon launches and sending balloons up with radio transmitters that would either just show location, or could also be hooked up to sensors so you could monitor pressure and temperature changes. And anyway, the whole point was that radio is a part of so much of science, even if it was just for a remote station to send temperature data to a weather station to aggregate, temperatures across your pond or wherever you were trying to monitor. That involves wireless communication. Or if you're doing something with using a remote control for your television, that involves sending at least visual data. And so one of the things we did in the workshop was actually hook up to an oscilloscope and start making a little device that you could see the pulses that your remote control sent. And so we developed with our with these microprocessors a little robot that you could actually use a cheap universal remote at and point it, and you could make the robot move whatever direction you wanted because you had cracked the code of the remote. Yeah, it was. And those kinds of things are really interesting. And as both a teacher and I think for students, it was really neat to be able to pull that out and said, here's what I got to do at my workshop. You're going to do part of this, and then just put the robot on the floor and drive it, and then have another student, take the remote and do the same thing. And so they realized that it's not just a toy, but it's a toy that they could figure out how it works and change it.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. How easy were the lessons that you learned at the Teachers Institute to apply to the classroom when you went back?
That's a great question. Some were extremely easy and others were much more difficult, and some turned out to be, at least for my setting, less tenable. I mentioned that since I'm teaching middle school students, getting them ready to take a test, I know that there are some students who can do that, but their interest in how much knowledge it would take to pass a ham radio license exam is far more detailed than learning how, for example, to build something, an piece of electronics that does things. One of my most successful takeaways from that workshop was they gave us a schematic for a Morse code oscillator that was done on a literal piece of wood. So it was an old-fashioned breadboard with little screws and washers to hold the wires down. And so we had a local electronics engineer in our club who helped me refine the schematic and have it require fewer connections. So we got it down to 13 screws and washers on a board. And so I got a local amateur radio club in Springfield to help fund the purchase of some of the electronics. And then later, because we were successful with just a small pilot, I asked the TAPR, the Tucson Area Radio Packet, I forget what the R is, but anyway, there was a club out of Tucson that helped fund the rest of it. And so over the course of the next 7 or 8 years, I think easily 250 or more students have built a little Morse code oscillator after instruction on both the electronics, and every day we would do like 2 Morse code letters, and so that they were at least familiar with Morse code. And then when they built the project, it had the schematic on the board, and they shows them where to put the screws, and it had the circuit symbols for the hardware that they were doing. And then off on the right-hand side was a cheat sheet of Morse code symbols. And that was really one of my most successful takeaways. The other thing that was nice was the stuff eventually with the microprocessors. We were not able to do all of the stuff with the basic stamps, but the Arduino was much more accessible and cheaper, and it was open source. And so eventually I was able to do some piloting with an after-school program with that, and that eventually led to a teaching of a STEM class that was just focused on both learning how to use computers and how to do programming of microprocessors. And the kids built setups where they had like multiple lights blinking, where they had the Arduinos playing songs, and the ultimate project was that they were to build an automated fish food feeder, and they were having to figure out how much the fish needed and figure out how much a servo could move to dispense a measured amount of fish food for several days, and so they had to figure out what the frequency was of how often the fish needed to be fed. And anyway, that was a project that took a long time to eventually implement, but through a series of grants and through just some regular building supplies, we were able to have a really fully equipped STEM classroom that I really, really liked. And it was shortly after that I retired and decided to do that with friends of families, children whom I know that were interested in electronics, and sort of do that on a smaller scale rather than in an entire classroom.
With your ARRL Teacher Institute training and your experience as a teacher and doing STEM education, do you think that amateur radio is at all relevant to students today?
Oh, very much so. Not necessarily the way that it's always been done in the past, and I don't want to not say that some of that isn't interesting. I understand that people who want to learn Morse code is on the rise over the last several years, but the things that they do that they don't realize is related to amateur radio is enormous. All of the Wi-Fi that's going on with their phones is radio related. All of the stuff that their phone does, talking to the cell tower, is radio related. All of the Bluetooth is radio related. And so they don't realize that they're doing radio every day when they sit down and bend their necks over and exercise their thumbs, that they're doing things involving radio. And now with the advent of accessible software-defined radio dongles and whatnot, that when you talk about car remotes or garage remotes or all of the household security systems, all of that is related to radio. And so understanding radio, I think, really can benefit them. And they are very interested when it relates to their lives. They're not particularly interested, kind of like I see it through the same eyes I did as an early elementary student, seeing this ham's shack, and while being impressed, wasn't interested. And I think that because I couldn't relate to it. But as I've gotten older now, some of the things that are going on throughout the world and being able to talk to somebody from China or Cuba is kind of a bigger deal, because I know what it takes for somebody like that to be able to be on the air in the first place. But that means more now as an adult than it did as a kid. But I think students respond to things that affect them. And one of the things that the Teacher Institute did was help me realize how many facets of our lives are affected by radio. Weather satellites communicate using radio. And the fact that one of the things I came home and did after the Institute was I found the software and built a quadrihelix antenna and set it out in the yard and ran a cable from my computer out to the backyard and actually picked up and decoded a weather satellite transmission in real time. And that was exciting. And I remember doing that with the students once as well. I plugged a software-defined radio dongle into a laptop and showed them up on the screen, and then we listened to a weather satellite pass. So those things are interesting to kids because they can relate to it.
Do you think that STEM is for every child or just gifted children?
Oh, no. I don't think it's just for gifted children. Gifted children are good at almost everything that they're interested in. So, it's easy to teach to really bright students. I think that the trick is, how do you figure out, we used to call them reluctant learners, that how do you find something that they are interested in that can maybe spark them to go on and learn more? One of the things that I have always enjoyed as I've become more involved in amateur radio is the can-do-it attitude. And it's particularly strong in the do-it-yourself or the homebrew.
The maker movement.
Yep, the maker movement. And it's the maker movement, it's the homebrew, is the do-it-yourselfers. It's the same attitude. It's, I don't know how to do this, but I can learn how to do this. And I think that when kids are imbued with that belief, the world is open to them. The ones that I feel the most sorry with are the ones who think, I'm bad at math because I've always been bad at math. And they think that it's something systemic in them that won't change. And one of the things that the Teacher Institute had was, it had I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the effect that it's not that I can't do it, it's just that I haven't learned how to do it yet. And that technology is not something that's just this inaccessible thing. You can learn how to do it. It's just going to take some time. And I think that teaching students that is really a life skill, whether you teach it through math or science and technology, or you teach it in other ways. I think we have done our students a lot of disservice by not teaching to mastery and helping them to realize that, yes, you could memorize the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, or the
Constitution,
or the preamble of the Constitution, or part of the Gettysburg Address, or a variety of other things that we don't require them to master. It's just you experience it and then we move on. And I think that mastery helps kids. And this is one of the things that scouting did, is it wasn't that the skills that kids learned on scouting were necessarily applicable to life, but I mean, sometimes they were if you were out in the wilderness lost, but they learned that they could learn, and they realized that it just took effort. And, lots of times kids don't have that for a variety of reasons.
I mean, with your experience with kids, what could amateur radio clubs do to bring kids into the club and make them maybe start to appreciate ham radio? What would you do if you were the educational director of your ham radio club?
Oh, my goodness. Well, one of the things that one of our local club members has done, Scott N7Ji, has done is he worked in conjunction with our local science center. We have a hands-on science center that he realized had a little bit of extra space in one corner, and said, how would you feel if we had a staffed amateur radio station there? And so students kids and parents could come while they were doing it, see somebody communicating either voice or Morse code or digitally with somebody in Australia or some other part of the country, and have them get on the air. That's a neat thing that I think has been going on that can impact students. I think outreach, for example, with the Morse code oscillators, I realized early in the game that as one teacher, there was no way I was going to help 35 students at a time be able to build a project that worked and still retain my sanity. So I enlisted local club members to help me with the project. And so I literally had anywhere from 5 to 6 amateur radio folks from 2 different clubs in the area come to our school and be one-on-one with the kids who are struggling the most. And I was able to supervise and still be able to manage the classroom setting, but being able to be involved in some local things is really neat. We have another situation where I know that this is not as applicable to everybody, but there are schools that have opportunities where they communicate with the International Space Station during a flyover. And that involves having local amateur radio club members be involved in helping with doing that, because most schools don't know how to do that at all. And so those would be some things. Those are some big things. But I think really the things that are most likely are finding somebody a neighbor, for example, who's got a child who's interested in electronics, to work out a way to help them, maybe one-on-one, or just to be an Elmer. I think one-on-one is probably the most effective in the long term and the most easy to do for any ham.
Well, I can relate to that. I've had electronic students in my shop, and it's very rewarding, especially when they end up choosing that as a career path, 10 years later, because they'll come back and they'll say, oh, it was because we built this Arduino thing, or we built this device. I always build with my students the thing I want the next time. So,
yeah. So
I have an interest in it as well. Now that you have your ham radio license, how do you spend your ham radio time?
Well, lately, I spend it more with the goings-on of the club itself. A couple of years ago, our club was restructured to become a 501c3 organization, and I stepped on as a member at large on the board of directors. And so instead of spending more time on the air like I was hoping during retirement, I've spent more time online dealing with some of the behind-the-scenes things to help the club weather both some of the activities and all the COVID adjustments that we had to make. But I have just the other day gotten on FT8 and made a whole bunch of contacts on 20 meters and then 40 meters when 20 went dead. So my goal is to get on the air a whole lot more than I have been. And I have been learning Morse code. I've gotten my decoding up to roughly about 11 words a minute. 13, I don't get enough that I feel comfortable doing that in the exchange. But
Are you taking a course? Are you working with CW Academy or Long Island CW Club?
no, what I've been doing is I've been downloading the ARRL's Morse code practice and just been listening to that with a piece of paper and writing stuff down. And that has been very effective. And I think I'm probably ready to do more CW than I think I am, but, fear sets in, so I'll get over it.
I completely understand that. So would you say that FT8 is your favorite operating mode at the moment?
At the moment, yes, but I've done voice. I'd like to participate in some of the contests, not to compete, but I know that a lot of people are on the air at that time. So I still do a variety of volunteer work after retirement. So there's only certain times of the day that I can get on, and so sometimes it gets frustrating when there are not very many people on the band locally, or that I can hear in my area given my station setup. So FT8 has been a way to get a lot of context really quickly.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, I saw that you made a presentation to your local radio club about building an auto keyer for radio fox hunting. So essentially you're turning a rig on for a short period of time so people can get a bearing. How important or how popular is fox hunting in your club?
It has become much more popular even during COVID. In fact, there was an ARRL podcast about that very thing not too long ago. But our club recently designated a particular individual to be what we call a bunny master, and he's been doing a great job. We have one every 2 or 3 months. We have a fox hunt, and we've had a lot of people attend regularly, and then it's brought out some families as well, which has been fun. So they haven't used my particular device, but I did mine originally because I couldn't afford the one that we could buy when I was teaching school, and so I wanted it for my students. But I also realized at the time that it was really hard to manage without a whole lot of other adult help. And since we were already doing the Morse code oscillators, that one kind of went by the wayside. But it was an intriguing project, and I like doing things that help me learn. And so I took on that project to help me realize how you could automatically key a radio with a relay, and how to get an Arduino to put out a sound that sounded nice and then transmit it on a regular basis. So that was why I did it.
At the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo last August, you made a nice presentation on Hiram Percy Maxim called Early Radio in the ARRL. What brought you to the expo, and why did you choose this subject?
Well, at the end of last year, the ARRL was doing a closeout of books and I have had a lot of their books and have read a lot of them, and this was a little different. It was a personal history of Hiram Percy Maxim, and it was cheap. So as a typical ham, I thought, hey, I'll buy it when it's cheap. And as I read it, I just became more and more impressed with this man who did far more than just amateur radio. And the more I read it, the more I thought, I think other people would be interested. And as a teacher, I've always learned that you learn more by teaching than by reading. And so I thought, well, if I prepare to do this as a presentation for my local club, I'll remember it better. And so I started doing that, and I have a very good friend and mentor, Dave Cole, NK7Z, who is just a wonderful helper and friend of mine. And he said, why don't you throw in your hat to do the QSO Today, because you've already got the presentation partly prepared. And so I thought, well, maybe other people might be interested. And I was surprised that you all thought it was worthwhile. And so I prepared it. And then the more I prepared, the more I had to go back to the book and realize, this is how that story really happened, and wanted to tell it right. And anyway, it was just encouragement by somebody else who helped me to get involved in doing the presentation.
What do you think the greatest takeaway was from your study of Hiram Percy Maxim that you ended up imparting in that presentation?
Oh, wow. I think that I was very impressed with how much one man could impact the culture of so many areas. He not only impacted amateur radio, but there are three businesses, three very diverse companies that still have his name on it. And he affected a lot of people. And he somehow managed to do it without a lot of egotistical behavior. In fact, he was nicknamed the beloved gentleman. And you don't get people who are leaders of companies and organizations called the beloved gentleman very often. So for me, I realized that working with people and trying to do it politely and patiently can yield tremendous results.
As a ham for almost 50 years, I'd always heard about Hiram Percy Maxim, but from your presentation, I learned that he was actually so much more. So I thank you very much for putting it up on the expo.
Thank you.
Now that you're in the club and you're in the fraternity, what do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Well, apart from some of the remnants of COVID, getting people together and having them share each other's interests, I think is going to be the first step, because you can't do one-on-one if people are worried about getting infected. But I think, if things were back the way they were pre-COVID, I think that age is probably one of the most difficult parts. There's a lot of disconnect in the eyes of the youth and the adults who are involved in amateur radio about whether or not one has something to offer the other. But I have found that young people really are far more fun to work with than you would think. For example, when I was doing stuff with microprocessors, my youngest son was in early middle school, and he had a best friend named Ryan. And my son David and Ryan would be together when I was experimenting, and then they would start to ask, well, what about this and what about that? And I realized early on that they could think outside the box and come out with ideas that I would never have thought of to do things with a microprocessor. For example, we could control something with a Wiimote, and so we had it so that it would turn on lights depending on how you rotated the remote, the Wiimote. And I never would have thought of that, or times when I did this. Well, I don't want to go into details about the other projects, but there were all sorts of projects I never would have thought of if I hadn't been working with kids who just thought the sky's the limit. And on the flip side, I think that, as I mentioned, with getting adults to help mentor younger kids who are interested in that kind of thing, to help maybe volunteer in schools, even if it's not about amateur radio, just meeting somebody, and after a while you get to know them, and then all of a sudden their hobby becomes much more interesting because the person that you're visiting with is interesting. I think that those kinds of things can have a profound effect on amateur radio. I think with the software-defined radio coming out so accessibly now to so many different people, doing presentations on that, or doing something, for example, at a local park and rec club to show how stuff like that works, and having people do it would be, I think, very fascinating and be an opportunity for amateur radio. But I think that one of the biggest ones is just the age, and then cell phones. So on the flip side, you can do stuff now with cell phones like decode CW, or do stuff with Echolink that you couldn't do before without a laptop. So I think that cell phones are a blessing and a curse depending on how you look at it.
Do you think that society is raising children to fear adult males?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
I get that sense. That's why, I remember as a kid wandering into people's garages because they were open in Southern California, and every male was working on some project. I have told this story before, but I had a neighbor building an airplane in his garage, and when he finally finished it, he invited me and my brothers to fly in it, and my mother said yes. Nowadays, people would think my mother was crazy, but I got to ride in an airplane at 11 years old with my two brothers and all of my mother's offspring for the $100 hamburger. It changed my life. But I see that there's a fear in society now of the old codgers that are working in the garage, and that kids don't come around. What do you think about that?
Well, I give great praise to your mother for letting you do that. That's pretty amazing. I'm not sure I would have done that for my kids, but I certainly would have let them go watch, though. But I don't get kids wandering into my garage, but I do have friends who have younger children who are interested in, for example, microprocessors. And our church youth group, some of the older young men, the ones who were like 16 and 17 or something, knew that I had done it. We had done it once before in scouting, and they said, hey, we'd like to have you show us again and have us do some coding to make some lights blink or to make the Arduino make some noises. And one of the other young men leaders had a son who was 10. He said, hey, Dad, I'm really interested in this. Can I go too? And so Dad said yes. And so he came on over. And after we were visiting for a little while, this young boy is just remarkable. And so I offered the dad some of my time to say, if you're interested, I'd be happy to have him come over with you to learn about the project. To learn more about this. And so we did that twice. And then the third time I went over to their house while the other kids were there. And so we avoided the creepy male thing by himself with a kid. And so I always make sure that there's two of us, two other people besides.
Kind of like the Boy Scouts. I was a scoutmaster. That was kind of the requirement.
Yep, two deep leadership.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good idea.
And I would always do that as a school teacher. And if I ever didn't, I would always tell my neighbor in the classroom next to me, hey, the door is open because I'm in there with the student who's got something to do, but it's a young lady. So please, just know that this is where the situation is and we're making the best of it. But, just you can intelligently take care of most hurdles with those kinds of things, I think, especially if you know the parents.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for answering that question.
I'm not a defeatist. I'm an optimist. And so I always figure, well, this is the situation. What can I do today to make at least my portion of what I'm trying to do better? And so I realize rather than just give up, I'll say, well, I always make sure that I let the parents know if I ever have to talk to the young man about any of his projects. It'll be a group text as opposed to individual. Or if it's an individual, I'll let the parents know, hey, I want to talk to him about X, Y, or Z so that they know. So if I just try to be proactive about it, it hasn't been a problem.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
The band conditions are improving. That's been nice.
It is good.
Yeah. And I think the thing that excites me the most is still the fact that most of the hams with whom I associate have that can-do attitude, that you can be self-taught and learn a lot. And if you get stuck, that there are people out there to help you, whether it be to put up an antenna or to troubleshoot a rig or to even just get started. How do I participate in a net? One of the things that I like about our club is that we have a lot of different people, and some who have different interests, and some are very interested in MCOM. Others would say, you know what, we have a lot of people who are really concerned about getting started. And so we have a now what net where people who just got their license, now what do they do? And so it's just mostly brand new hams working through with other people who have had more experience, helping each other. And I think that the part of amateur radio that I think that Hiram Percy Maxim helped set up, he said that amateur radio isn't just a group of experts who never make a mistake. It's a group of people who are willing to work together to be a worldwide brotherhood and help foster interest in radio.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams now to the hobby, from your perspective?
Well, I would encourage them to explore all of the many different facets of amateur radio, whether it be the physics of radio or supporting races where the runners are checked in using amateur radio, or portable communication, or helping with propagation, learning about wireless communication, or homebrew or DX or whatever. That there are so many different facets. And to steal from a commercial that you probably remember as well, try it, you'll like it, and get involved. Well, and if you don't know, you can learn. I think that would be the big takeaway. And I originally got interested in amateur radio because of the technology and the fascination with what was going on and the magic of radio, but I stayed because of the people. And you didn't ask me a lot about some of my early mentors, but they are, in my mind, some of the greatest people because they helped profoundly influenced my life. And it's nice to think that maybe down the road I might be able to do that for somebody else. But as I got to know the people more and more, it kept me involved with trying things that I wouldn't otherwise. For example, my QSO Today presentation wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had a good mentor encourage me to do it. I would not have gone to the Teacher Institute if a good mentor hadn't suggested that that was an option. And I could go list numerous other things that I wouldn't have been on the board of directors for a local club if I hadn't had some encouragement from somebody else. And so I think that the part that's exciting is that if people can still get together and promote something that I think is very, very interesting, which is amateur radio.
Nelson, it has been such a great pleasure to speak with you and have this conversation. As I said before, it's like two of us getting together in the Denny's in Eugene and sharing coffee and learning about you. And I'm so happy that you agreed to come on the QSO Today podcast and have this conversation with me. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thank you, 73, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Nelson. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in NF7Z in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.